Well, good morning. I am, gosh, I love Christmas. I even just that like little jingle behind that just makes me happy. Um, I love Christmas traditions too, and I have a very unique relationship with one of them in particular. I love Christmas lights. I love driving around town with my son, looking at them. Like we try to drive slow in like the right neighborhoods. We're like, oh my gosh, look at those lights, Luke. Look at those lights, and he gets all excited. I also like it's the worst to try to climb up on my roof and put lights up. But after it's done, I love it. But it's do you have any of those traditions where it costs you something while you're doing you're like, "Oh, I just don't want to be up here. I'm going to fall. I'm going to break my leg. Something's going to happen, but it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. At the end of the day, it's going to be worth it because those lights are straight. Um, you got to get them in order, right? But do you have any traditions about December 26th? Anybody? Anybody have any? We think about the pre-Christmas traditions. We don't often think about the day after Christmas traditions. The day after Christmas traditions. These are the ones, and maybe I don't know. I don't want to like categorize anyone, so please forgive me ahead of time if I offend you. But I believe that there's a specific demographic that is probably more likely to do this than some others, where you sit down the day after and you're going through the list of all the gifts that you got, and then you're like making a second list of all the gifts that you're going to return, and you're like, this one's going, and you maybe even the day after. I don't do this, but maybe the day after you're actually literally going to the store, which is crazy and it's nuts and it's chaos out there. But maybe that's part of your day after Christmas tradition that you actually go and you return all of your Christmas presents, or at least some of them, right afterwards. I think in this valley we probably do a lot more online returns than at the store, but maybe that's just my family. I don't know. But the original Christmas story, like when Jesus was born, that moment, everybody was ready to get back to normal. Like they were ready to tear down. There weren't any Christmas direction or decorations, but they were ready. If there would have been, they would be ready to take those down because this was chaos. Because something had happened. Luke chapter 2 verse 1 tells us that in this time, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This required that everybody goes back to their hometown to be counted. This wasn't like a, hey, let's make sure that the website's updated. We have the right population numbers posted. No, this was all about taxes. And I'm going to withhold any jokes about the IRS and taxes right now. But essentially, this was Caesar Augustus making sure that everybody possible was paying their proper taxes, that they were getting every last penny out of everyone. That's what all this was about. So at this point, there was no Christmas, there was just chaos. No Christmas, just chaos. Everybody was ready to go back to normal, to go back to the way that life was before this whole season of census happened. But the world would never be the same. In this moment, there was a child that was born, and not just any child was born. In this moment, the world would never go back to the same that it was before. It would forever be changed. 2,000 years later, it is absolutely still changed. It would never be the same. John is one of the disciples, and he actually writes down what he is trying to like form the words as what this was like when Jesus was born, when God came to earth. He writes, the Word, meaning God, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That God became man and lived with us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That God somehow comes down to earth in this moment, in this season. And it's incredible because just like right now, everybody fights in like tooth and nail, trying to make a name for yourself, trying to be remembered beyond yourself, trying to have a legacy, have a dynasty, have something that long after we're gone that people would remember us, that people would talk about us, that people would have good emotions about the time that we spent with them. It's the same at this time with Jesus as well. And interestingly enough, everybody else, regardless of how much authority and power you had in this moment, everybody else becomes a footnote in the story of this baby. See, a king had been secreted into the world. A king had been like smuggled, snuck into the world. People weren't aware what was happening. It wasn't just that he was a religious figure. It wasn't just that he was a baby. It wasn't just that he was a rabbi, a good teacher. He was a king that had been snuck, that had been smuggled, that had been secreted into the world. And this king would grow. And this king would become someone that didn't demand of his people, but rather served others. Rather than being served, he prioritized giving back and doing for others. And then he charged his followers to do the exact same as well. And not just for one another, for their enemies too. That we are to do something on behalf of someone else, whether we like them or not. But what we think of Jesus, changes, right? Because we typically, when we initially think of Jesus, just a word in your brain, we think of this: phone a friend. Like, in my time of need, I'm going to call Jesus. I'm going to talk to him. He's going to calm me down. He's going to talk me off the ledge. Like, in my time of need, in my emergency, Jesus is going to be there for me. I'm going to call him. I'm going to feel better. I'm going to vent to him. And I'm going to talk it out. It's going to be great. That's what Jesus is for. That's maybe what you think of when you think of Jesus. Or maybe he's a backup plan. You have all your plans in place, and you're going to try as hard as you can to make sure that those work out. But just in case, in your back pocket, you have a back pocket Jesus. Like, oh, I'll just pull that one out. My plans didn't work. I guess I'll go along with his. Or maybe this might be the biggest one: the conscience reliever. That we might mess up in life. Yeah, nobody's perfect. We make mistakes all the time. It's like, well, at least I have Jesus to make me feel better. I say a prayer, I ask for forgiveness, and all of a sudden, my conscience can be relieved in that moment. I can feel better about it. Thank you, Jesus, for making me feel better. A comforter, whether a blanket or a good friend. But this is what we typically think of when we think of Jesus. But he's so much more. He's so much more than that. And while the gravity of what we think of when we think of Jesus, while who Jesus is might get lost on us, it was not lost on a teenage girl about 2,000 years ago. Luke chapter 1, verse 30. This is Mary. An angel shows up and says, "Do not be afraid, Mary," which, pause, if an angel shows up, I'm going to be like pretty nervous. If an angel shows up and talks to me directly and uses my name, I'm going to be scared. Like, that's just the reality. I'll be honest with you. If an angel showed up in my room and was like, "Hey, Andrew," I'd be like, "Oh gosh, what did I do? What did I do?" He continues on though. He says, "You have found favor with God." This is a good visit. This is something that is beneficial, but not just to you, but to the world. He continues on. "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus." And this is a big deal at this time. There's a tremendous amount of context to this moment. It's because Mary, being a teenager, not being married yet, she was, pledged to be wed, but not married yet. This was a big deal. If she conceived, if she was pregnant, like, her husband could, at the very least, divorce her. At the very most, she could be killed because of this. So this is a big deal that this angel is showing up to tell her all of this is going to happen. But you're to call him Jesus. And this name Jesus is Yeshua, or like Joshua. Kind of means like leader. It continues on in verse 32. "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David." He's not just going to be a baby. There's something attached. I mean, if the announcement made by an angel wasn't like a clue enough to be like, this is a big deal, the language that he's using is royal language. That is like the supreme king of everything, the universe, is going to give you this son. And he will sit on the throne of his father David. This is language specifically that points back to the prophesied Messiah. That this would be a commander, a ruler, not just a friend, not just a good teacher, not just even a forgiver, something so much more than that. And what the angel says next plays out not just in that moment, not just the season after this that we read in the book of Acts, which is the Acts of the Apostles, where it's like how this baby fledgling movement goes out to the world and grows. But 2,000 years later, that what the angel says next is still being played out in verse 33. He says, his kingdom will never end. This king that's being born, that you are to birth, this kingdom will not end. His kingdom will not end ever. In fact, if you look kind of like the transliterated Greek at this time, it says, and of his kingdom there shall not be an end. Oh, you want to talk about that king's kingdom? There's no end to it. And this is what we believe. If you're a Jesus follower, this is what we believe today, that Jesus is still king today. Right now, in this moment, that Jesus is still king. And that's something worth getting excited about. If my mother-in-law was here, she would be cheering right now. It kind of blew my joke I was going to answer, but that's right. If we follow Jesus, and as we wrestle with all of this, and we read this, and we agree with it, we're like, okay, and maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you haven't crossed the line of faith. You're still wrestling with all that, and that's okay. We love that you're here. But if you have, and you read this and you're like, yeah, Jesus is still king, I have a massive question for you. And this question is bigger than any other question, in my opinion. This is the biggest question that you could be asked in your entire life. From day one to the last day. This is the biggest question that you could ever be asked in your life. Is Jesus my king? Jesus is still king, but is Jesus my king? Is he my personal king? Have I actually submitted to this king? Have I decided that he is ruler of my life? Not just that I agree with him, not just that I believe in him, but I follow this king. That I've chosen with my life to move in his direction. Often we grow up and we continue on in the direction that, if you grew up going to church, we kind of just continue on in that vein and that mentality and mindset. And I'm not here to say that other churches are bad or anything like that, because I grew up in another church too. But what I want to ask is the direction that church handed you, is it more like along the lines of the conscience cleanser? Because that's what I really grew up with. That Jesus was there to make me feel better, that I was able to say, Jesus, forgive me of my sins, and he would every single time say yes, and then I would feel better about myself. That's what I grew up with. This is different than that. He's not just a friend for moments of emergency. It's not just like a nice thought that I like, if you have a necklace with a cross on, you're like, I just think of this and it's nice. Or maybe if you're a little edgy, you got a tattoo or something. I don't know. But it's more than that. That Jesus is king. And this king invites and intrudes. And he invites us to follow him. This is the language that he used with his disciples. When he started his ministry, he would ask them, hey, will you follow me? And 2,000 years later, today, he still asks us and invites us to follow him. But then there's this weird thing that if we decide to follow him, we find him starting to intrude in other areas of our life. We're like, no. I said I would follow you for an hour on a Sunday morning, Jesus. But you're actually, there's a tension in my life now with this relationship or with my finances or with this situation at work. You weren't invited to that part of my heart. Just this one little square corner. That's what I was giving you. It's amazing how he seems to just intrude into those other areas. And unfortunately, when I opt out of allowing Jesus access in those moments, I miss out. I miss out. Because faith is meant to be more than just religion. And if we opt out of allowing Jesus to be king of every aspect of our life, that's truly what it becomes. It just becomes a system in order to get to to meet an end, a means to an end. That's what it becomes. A system with a means to an end. This is so much more than that. What Jesus came to do was that heaven was meant to meet earth with a sloppy, wet kiss. And if you don't get that, it's lyrics to a song. I'm sorry, because that's out of the blue, without context. That gets a little bit like, that's a weird one. I haven't heard that one before. That's all right. But you will say with your words, Jesus, forgive me. You will ask for forgiveness. You will live with assurance, but you will miss out on something so great, so much more. You will miss out if you're not fully submitted to his lordship. You will miss out on his kingship in your life and in your world day in and day out. A king was secreted into the world. Not just a friend, not just a forgiver, not just a phone my friend in emergency, not just a conscience cleanser. A king was secreted into the world. And if it hadn't been for some men, some wise men, it probably would have stayed a secret except for a very, very small amount of people for about the next 30 years or so. But instead, some wise men find out about this. We're going to talk about them in a second. And all of a sudden, this secret is not secret any longer. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. He writes, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod. We need to talk about Herod for a second. King Herod was known as Herod the Great, and he truly was great. He rebuilt the temple, so he's like a master architect. He was a brilliant military strategist. He did a lot of things really great. And when it came to his dynasty, when it came to his legacy, he was ruthless. He was so incredibly cruel. He would do whatever he possibly could to protect that. That was his singular goal, that his dynasty, his legacy would be set in stone forever. And not only that, but his plan was like that he would be king, and then his kids would be king, and it would set up this entire dynasty after him. He says, so continuing on, during the time of King Herod, Magi, meaning wise men, from the east came to Jerusalem. Now these men, we're going to talk about the wise men for a little bit this morning, and I'm going to warn you, it's going to challenge some of the things that you were taught before. Some of the preconceived notions, you're like, wait, that's going to burst my bubble. That's exactly what it might happen. And that's okay. But let's talk about them. These men were very educated, very smart, very intelligent men. They were from Persia or Asia or both. They studied ancient texts. They knew them very, very well. And not only did they study ancient texts, they also studied the stars in the sky. Is that astrology? I believe astronomy. I always get I'm like, one of those two. They did that. So they studied the stars in the sky. They studied the ancient texts. They believed that there were connections between what was happening in the heavens and what was happening in earth and the ancient texts, and that somehow if you combined those two, you could actually find out what would be happening, that there's a divine thing that would show you what was going to happen based on what prophecies were. So these men, we think that there's three of them. We just assume that because there's three gifts that they brought. There's no mention of how many. There could have been more, there could have been less. We don't know. There's three gifts, however many they were. They brought three gifts. So that's another big one. They were not kings. So we three kings of Orient are, nope, that's just a song. That came up a couple hundred years later. It's like a myth. It's like a legend. They weren't kings. And there weren't three of them. Well, they could have been three, I guess. But we don't know exactly how many there were. We also don't know their names. So a couple of hundred years later, there's some myths, there's some legends, and some people and some teachings are like, no, these are their names. The scripture, the Bible, the historical documents of that time don't actually list their names. There's other documents, a couple hundred years later that start to insert some names, but we don't know their actual names. So there's a lot we don't know about the wise men. But they come and they recognize that there's a star that rose, and they immediately, because of their knowledge of ancient texts, they know that this star that rose was to announce that there was a new Jewish king. That's what they know. So in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, continuing on, they show up and they say, so they're in Jerusalem, they show up and they say, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw the star when it rose and have come to worship him. So they show up where it is logical that there would be a new Jewish king. Jerusalem. That's very, very logical. There's a new Jewish king, you go to Jerusalem. That's what you do. So they show up and no one knows what they're talking about. They're like, wait, there's what? There's a new king? Haven't heard that one yet. We're just we still have our own, that's not a thing that we know about. So they're asking around town. There are these foreigners, there are these wise men. Word is getting out that this is happening in the area, and it gets back to Herod. So, look at the next verse. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. It doesn't take like a whole lot of. We know why he was disturbed, because his dynasty was in danger all of a sudden. If there was a new king that was being born, that was proclaimed by the heavens, that these men, foreign men from faraway lands, traveled all the way to find and worship this newborn king, he was in trouble. If it was a rabbi, that would have been fine. It's like another leader, another teacher, that's okay. We have lots of those. That's fine. If it was just like another Jewish teacher, another Jewish leader, if it was somebody else, it would have been fine. But a king, this was different. A king he could not be okay with, because he did not want his legacy to be in danger. And Herod was a king for like 40 years. That's a long time. And he wasn't king for that long because he was reactive. He was king for that long because he was very proactive. He would get information, he would go and do something about it. And we're gonna learn more about this moment next week also. But Herod, he does one of the worst things possible in order to try to protect what he can't stop. He tries to stop what cannot be stopped in this moment. So in this moment, he tips us off to something else that's happening, though. Something that we often miss that tells us about Jesus. So in verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests, so he gets this information. He's like, okay, I need the people that are in the know. He calls together the chief priests, the teacher of the law, and he asks them where the Messiah was to be born. Now, what's interesting here, obviously this isn't just a rumor. This is proclaimed in the heavens, but why did Herod insert Messiah? Why did he use this in his language? Messiah was the term for God's final king for all time. And Herod uses this language, Messiah. Messiah meant like anointed one. Why did Herod use Messiah, the anointed one? It's interesting, the Greek word for Messiah, Christos, Christ. So when we say Jesus Christ, when we hear that word Christ, that's not a last name, that's not a nickname, that is a title, it's a descriptor, a title of God's final king. Right? If we look back in verse 4, he inquired of them, this is what it means, he inquired of them where the Christos, the Messiah, singular, would be born. A king had been born. A king had absolutely been born. And Herod was terrified of this baby. They did not know his name. We know his name. We often miss the kingship part. We've allowed the person, right? We've allowed the person of Jesus to define the term. We hear Christ, we don't think of king. We don't think of Messiah. We think of Jesus, my forgiver, rather than allowing the term to define the person, that Jesus was first and foremost king. So let me break it down and make it as simple as possible for all of us. His name is Jesus. His title is God's anointed one. Not that he was anointed by a priest, not that he was anointed by a man. He was anointed by God, the creator of all. The King, the Messiah, the Christ. Title, Jesus Christ. Jesus, the King. And Herod knew what we miss, right? He knew what we miss. When a king is born, people must choose. When a king is born, people must choose. Herod experienced this in his own personal life. Herod experienced this with his kids. When a king, a royal person is born, people must choose their response, what they're going to do. It is easy for us, so far removed from this moment, it's easy for us to reduce Jesus to less than king. But when a king shows up, people must choose. There's this interview we're going to look at. It's an interview with C.S. Lewis, and it's quickly becoming one of my favorite, just like interviews of all time. But this is what he says. I believe it's a radio interview, but he says, I wonder whether people who ask God to interfere openly and directly in our world quite realize what it will be like when he does. You see, because we want a fixer. We want, Jesus, will you fix this? Jesus, will you fix him? Jesus, will you fix her? We want like Febreze Jesus. Just let me mist it around a little bit. It'll make my environment a little bit more enjoyable. But don't overwhelm me. Just a little misting, Jesus. That's not what C.S. Lewis is talking about. He says, when this happens, it is the end of the world. When the author walks, I love this, when the author walks onto stage, the play is over. That's it. God is going to invade. All right. But what is the good of saying you are on his side then? When God shows up, now is not the time. That's not it. To say, oh, I'm on your side. I'm on your team. No, he says, when you see the whole natural universe melting away like a dream, and something else, something it never entered your head to conceive, comes crashing in, something so beautiful to some of us, and so terrible to others, that none of us will have any choice left. For this time, it will be God without disguise. Not a baby in a manger. Not someone that's a good teacher and we're like, is he, isn't he? We're going to wrestle with it. We're going to figure out it. No. There will be no more disguise. He will show up in his full breadth of God, of King. Not a man that's arrested and crucified and we're like, I don't know, I'm not sure. God will arrive without disguise. C.S. Lewis continues, something so overwhelming that it will strike either irresistible love or irresistible horror into every creature. It will be too late then to choose your side. There is no use saying you choose to lie down when it has become impossible to stand up. That will not be the time for choosing. It will be the time when we discover which side we really have chosen, whether we realized it before or not. You see, we often think, well, I'm just not sure about it yet, so I'm just going to push pause on that. And by pushing pause, you're making a decision. By withholding a decision, you're actually making a decision. And I don't want to pressure you into believing or not believing or making a choice or not making a choice, but I'm just saying that this decision is the biggest one of your existence in my perspective. This is the biggest one. So not making a decision is a choice. And I hope you don't get to a day when you realize that you'd already made a choice you did not think about before. So C.S. Lewis continues, now, today, this moment, is our chance to choose. God is holding back to give us that chance. It will not last forever. We must take it or leave it. On Christmas, a king was born. Is he my king? Is he your king? Have you decided that he is your king? Have you accepted this invitation to follow him? Not just to believe, but to follow. You see, Herod believed. Herod believed, strongly that Jesus was a king. He didn't know his name, but he believed that this baby was a king. And he believed so much to do something about it. But Herod did not follow Jesus. So he gets all the teachers of law and everybody together. He asks them, right? He asks them where this king is going to be born. And they tell him in Bethlehem. And then verse 7 of Matthew. Then Herod, after this, he called the Magi, the wise men, secretly, and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So now he has a location and he has a time. He knows the context of when and where this king was born. He was certain of it. He understood it. He believed it. But he was bound and determined to never kneel to another king. He had decided that he would not ever submit to anyone else's kingship or authority in his life. He decided that he would never surrender. Will you? Will I? This infant king would change the world forever. This infant king was bringing heaven to earth. That heaven was not just like a thing that we wait for after this life, but we invited heaven to invade this earth in this life that we live. And Jesus brought heaven everywhere that he went. In how well he loved others, in how well he served others, in how he prioritized them, how he valued them, the people that he reigned over. He did not feel like he was on top of, but he was serving them as well, first and foremost. He would upend this prevailing thought that unfortunately a lot of people still struggle with today, but that might makes right. And that's, at that time in context, if you had power and authority, you used that power and authority to get more power and authority. You did whatever you could. You used all your resources in order to get more resources. Sounds like today a little bit too. This king, though, this King Jesus, he utilized everything within his power and authority in order that he would serve those around him. He turned those resources back over to other people. He did what he could to make something bigger, not make himself bigger. Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, writes this in chapter 13, verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I've heard this verse, I've read this verse so many times in my life, over and over and over again. But to put it in terms of Jesus, the Messiah, the King, the anointed one of God, is the same. This King is the same yesterday and today and forever. In his kingdom, and of his kingdom, it will not end. That is good news. I'm going to have the band come back up because this morning we have one final opportunity today to respond with a song. And this song, you're going to have an opportunity, and maybe you want to just like read the lyrics. It might not be familiar to you. We're going to have the words up on the screen. It may be one that you just need to hear it. Maybe in this moment, your response is that instead of singing it, you start talking to God. Maybe you ask for him to actually come into your life, for him to come into your heart. For you, you may make a commitment. Today, God, today, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to recognize you as King. Not just King of the universe, but King of my life as well. Would you submit to Jesus as your King? Would you acknowledge him as more than a conscience cleanser, more than just a friend, more than just a good luck charm, or more than a Santa gift giver? God, would you give me this? Would you give me that? Would you acknowledge Jesus as King?
Light of the world, treasure of heaven, brilliant like the stars in the wintry sky. Joy of the Father, reach through the darkness, shine across the earth, send the shadows to fly. Light of the world, from the beginning, the tragedies of time were no match for your love. From great heights of glory, you saw my story. God, you entered in and became one of us. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah for the things he has done. Come and adore him, bow down before him, sing hallelujah. to suffer to save. High King of heaven, death is the poorer. We are the richer by the price that he paid. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah for the things he has done. Come and adore him, bow down before him, sing hallelujah to the light of the world. He's the light of the world. Light of the world, soon will be coming with fire in his eyes. He will ransom his own. Through clouds he will lead us straight into glory, and there he shall reign forevermore. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah for the things he has done. Come and adore him, bow down before him, sing hallelujah to the light of the world. He's the light of the world.
A king had been born. When we celebrate Christmas, it's not just about the gifts and the stockings. It's remembering that there is a king that was born, and a king that grew to be our Savior, but a king that still reigns today. And your decision of who that king is in your life, is he your king? Is he my king? I hope that you wrestle with that this week. I hope that tomorrow morning when you wake up, you're still wrestling with it and you make some decisions about it. Maybe your next step, the best thing that you might possibly do is to talk to someone about it. Like I said, we have next right now. I'm going to be in that front room. And if you have some questions as far as what that might look like for you, please, I would love to have a conversation. Hope you have a great week. Enjoy Christmas as it comes, and we'll see you next week.